President Biden and Vice President Harris are set to speak at the U.S. Capitol to mark the first anniversary of the January 6th riot. The remarks will be part of a larger day of commemoration planned by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, including a moment of silence on the House floor and a prayer vigil on the Capitol steps.
On the show today, we want to highlight a January 6th documentary produced earlier this year by Frontline PBS and ProPublica. It's called American Insurrection. It takes a deeper look at how far-right extremist groups evolved in the wake of the deadly 2017 Charlottesville rally and what role those groups had in the events of the Capitol breach.
From Charlottesville to the assault on the Capitol.
One of the darkest days in the history of our nation.
We're seeing this country fall apart before our eyes.
How the former president galvanized an army.
Who's our president? Trump's our president!
You've got a guy who's a nationalist in the most powerful seat in the world. We can actually win. We can actually get our views represented.
Proud boys, stand back and stand by.
So Trump encouraging calls to lock Whitmer up.
Lock them all up.
The far-right militias have felt much more licensed to publicly engage.
Terror plot to kidnap Governor Gretchen Whitmer.
And so you think the guys were planning to arrest her?
It was going to be a citizen's arrest.
Two militia groups who were preparing to kidnap and possibly kill me.
You don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
Violent mobs stoked by the words of President Trump stormed the building.
They were hostile. They were venomous, that their country somehow was being taken away from them.
A.C. Thompson is a reporter at ProPublica and a producer of the film. He joins us now to share his thoughts on the siege's anniversary. Welcome to Rising.
Thanks for having me.
So, this has been, January 6th has been a very exhaustively covered thing, deservedly so, in the mainstream media for the last year. What are the new insights that this film is trying to bring to the picture? You're highlighting the role that rising right-wing militias are playing in this and other events around the country. What does your reporting really show about them?
The thing that's been most interesting to me is when we were working on this update is we were out in the field at Trump rallies, we were at election integrity rallies around the country, and seeing that sort of the same ideas that animated January 6th are still absolutely motivating people across the country, that is what's motivating the Republican base. There's a huge number of Republican voters who absolutely believe that Joe Biden is an illegitimate president, that the 2020 election was a historic fraud, and that dramatic action needs to be taken to, quote, save the country. And that movement has outlasted all the arrests, all the backlash from January 6th, and continues to be a strong core of the Republican base.
So, AC, what kind of evolution have you seen since January 6th among the groups? You mentioned that there's still a dominant kind of faction within the movement, but what do they see as kind of the next step in this movement?
Some of this has turned to activism around COVID and about public health mandates. Some of it has turned to schools and critical race theory, and a lot of it is still focused on elections. And so what you see are people talking about, we need to go back to no machine voting. We need to go back to one-day voting. We need to go back to only on paper voting. And when you start talking to these folks and you start following them on social media, the next thing that they start doing is they start talking about killing the tyrants and lynching the tyrants and going after government officials and putting them to death for treason. So there's absolutely this policy piece of it, and then there's this very aggressive, violent piece of it.
So we haven't seen anyone that was involved in January 6th that was charged with sedition. So there doesn't seem to be much evidence to show that there is actually this sort of right-wing extremist, terrorist style organizations that are rising up and are a true threat. From what you saw, I mean, I'm very skeptical of all of this. I just think that this was a protest that got out of hand, much like we saw many protests around the country just get out of hand. And I think throughout history, one thing that really concerns me is that historically, narratives have been painted against predominantly leftist protesters, calling them terrorists, saying that they are against America, that they are traitors and treasonous to the country. Historically, this sort of language, this sort of demonizing and painting them for protesting, for speaking up against what they view as wrong or illegitimate elections. We've seen this before during the Democratic primary in Chicago. That was one of the main things that the liberal protesters were protesting against. So, what evidence are we actually seeing that these people are truly turning into these, dangerous domestic terrorists, and that we have to all watch out for them, rather than just being, people feeling like people have always felt and protesting, and maybe the protest somehow, some way going out of hand?
Yeah, so there's a couple of pieces there. One is that when people start talking about like a domestic terrorism statute, I think that that's not a great idea. I think that we've got the laws on the books to cover domestic terrorism. The FBI initiates domestic terrorism cases constantly under their code 266 in their vernacular, and there's plenty of legal framework to charge people who are engaged in that sort of activity without creating a new law. On the other hand, I think you're absolutely wrong. I think if you look at what's happened in this country for the last several years, you see a rising tide of people wanting to engage in violent acts to overthrow the government or to target their political opponents. In the run-up to the election, there were multiple shootings at protests before we even got to January 6th. Every time I went to D.C. and went to a Stop the Steal rally, there were acts of pretty spectacular violence. If you follow the social media, for example, the people who are involved in the Arizona audit and Stop the Steal movement there, the first thing that they start talking about on Telegram and other social media channels is we should go lynch the tyrants. We should go hang the tyrants. And they're talking about other government officials. I think you actually need to take that kind of rhetoric seriously.
Well, to piggyback on the point Kim's making, though, in your, in that trailer or that clip we just played, the so-called kidnapping plot for Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer was prominently highlighted. But there's been a lot of subsequent reporting that I think, casts some doubt on how genuine or from the ground up that that plot actually was. There was significant law enforcement involvement from the start, which those of us who've followed how law enforcement tricks so-called jihadists and other groups into seeming like they're actually doing something threatening, and it's controlled by law enforcement from the very start, seemed kind of familiar to me. How does your film kind of look at and handle that?
Yeah, our film was produced largely before there was almost any information about the FBI and about the agents involved in the FBI and about the informants. At the time we produced the bulk of our film, aside from the last 12 minutes, which we just recently shot, there was almost no information about those issues. What stood out to me, though, was the attorney for Ty Garbin, who pleaded guilty and has been sentenced to 6 years in prison and was one of the plotters, felt like, hey, there's enough evidence against my guy that he should take a deal. That attorney, Mark Satawa, also represented members of a militia called the Huttery in Michigan. And all those people basically got off because it was not a good government investigation. I'm not entirely sure how things will play out with that whole case, and there may be further issues that we learn about. I can tell you from interviewing Barry Croft, though, one of the alleged leaders of the plot, he's a person that I would be concerned about engaging in serious acts of violence.
And AC, what do you make of the recent moves on the right to highlight the role of provocateurs or FBI-linked provocateurs in January 6th? Is this anything that you came across in your own reporting?
I have not seen a lot of that, and I think most of that has been disproven or has been overplayed. There's always informants and there's always cooperating witnesses. There's always these sort of figures in any kind of big federal investigation. And you shouldn't expect anything different with January 6th. I haven't seen anything that makes me think that there were truly agents provocateur in the mix and really doing anything.
Well, AC, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.